The desert stretched endlessly before him, a vast sea of red earth and pale dust, dotted with scrub brush and scattered bones. Eli Cade rode slow, the reins loose in one hand, the other pressed hard against his side where the blood wouldn't stop leaking. His breath was shallow, lips cracked, and every jolt of the saddle sent fire through his ribs. The bullet lodged deep in his gut wasn't going anywhere, and he knew it. He'd seen enough men die to recognize when the reaper was closing in. His horse, an old gray named Gristle, moved like he knew the end was near, too quiet, obedient. No longer needing spurs or commands, they both knew where they were headed. Bitterwash. A ghost town now, but once it had been home or something close to it. Eli had spent his youth in that dust bowl, back when his name still meant something, back before he sold his soul for coin and reputation. He'd buried his brother just outside the chapel there, 10 years back, after a gunfight that had taken everything but his own heartbeat. He'd sworn never to return, and yet, here he was, bleeding out in the saddle, dragging what was left of himself back to the place where his past lay in ruins. He wasn't riding for salvation. There'd never been any for men like him. No preacher could cleanse his hands. No prayer could undo the things he'd done. But somehow, he felt drawn to that broken patch of earth, like the place itself called him home to die. It was fitting. He didn't want to be remembered, didn't expect mourners or mercy. He just wanted to rest where no one would find him. A final breath, alone, buried in dust and silence. The wind blew hard from the west, carrying with it the sour scent of creosote and old death. Buzzards circled above, black specks against a pale sky, as if they sensed a meal drawing near. Eli coughed, spat blood, and smiled. "Won't be long now, boys," he muttered. He had no family, no kin left. That would claim him. What few friends he'd once had were long buried, either by the law or by Eli's own hand. The trail behind him was littered with regrets, but none that mattered anymore. He'd outlived his enemies, outlasted his luck, and outrun justice for longer than most men could manage. But every streak ends. And now, with the sun sagging low and the horizon shimmering in heat, his streak had finally run out. He rode until the desert began to give way to old fence posts and crumbling signs. Bitterwash rose ahead, not with grandeur but with eerie stillness, a skeleton of a town. The wooden structures leaned like tired old men, beaten by years of storms and abandonment. The church steeple still stood, though its bell no longer rang. The saloon was missing its roof. The jail's iron bars were rusted and bent. The place had been swallowed by the land, returned to silence. Eli pulled Gristle to a halt just before the town's edge. The horse gave a groan and sank to its knees. Eli dismounted with a grunt, nearly falling to the dirt as his legs buckled. He steadied himself on a post, breathing hard, the blood soaking through his duster and dripping onto the dust. "Almost there," he said aloud. Though no one was listening, he looked around, eyes scanning the landscape. Nothing moved, no sound, no sign of life, just the wind and the ever-present buzzards overhead. It was exactly as he'd expected, and yet, as he stepped forward toward the overgrown graveyard beside the chapel, something caught his eye. Something wrong. There at the far corner of the cemetery, a fresh mound of dirt, new, untouched by time, too small for a full-grown man. Beside it sat a wooden box. A coffin, but not buried, just sitting there, waiting. And as the dying gunslinger stumbled toward it, every instinct in him screamed that death wasn't done with him yet. But maybe, just maybe, something else was. Something unexpected, something alive. Bitterwash had not changed, not in the ways that mattered. The wind still dragged through its alleys like a mourner's wail, and the dust still piled in the corners of buildings like time had given up on sweeping the place clean. Eli Cade limped past the collapsed general store, its sign hanging by a single rusted chain, groaning faintly as it swayed. Glassless windows watched him like empty eyes, the structures leaning and broken like drunks who'd never made it home. It wasn't just a dead town, it was a forgotten one, erased from maps, spoken of only in passing, a place people left and never returned to. Except for Eli, he followed the narrow path toward the chapel, his boots dragging, breath short. The church stood slightly apart from the town, like even the holy had once tried to escape Bitterwash. Its cross was split in half, one arm broken clean off, pointing downward like a warning. The double doors were still intact, though faded and warped. Vines snaked up the sides, claiming what little wood they could. But Eli didn't stop there. His eyes were drawn to the cemetery, or what was left of it, just beyond the chapel, where wild grass and thorns had overtaken most of the tombstones. The iron gate squealed open with effort, shrieking like it resented being disturbed. He didn't know why he was drawn there. Maybe it was his brother's grave. Maybe it was instinct. But with every slow, painful step, he felt the air grow heavier, colder, like the land itself held its breath. And then he saw it, at the far end of the graveyard. Tucked beneath the shade of a dying cottonwood tree was a small mound of fresh earth. The dirt was clean and recently turned, not yet scattered by the wind or hardened by the sun. Next to it sat something that did not belong, a small, open coffin, crudely built from pine planks. It was barely 2 feet long, with no lid, no nameplate, no flowers. Just a box, resting atop a burial plot, out in the open like some cruel joke. Eli's heart, already slowed from blood loss, gave a jolt. He blinked hard, thinking maybe it was his eyes playing tricks, but no, it was real. The box was open, and inside, wrapped in what looked like a blanket frayed with age and dust, lay a baby, a living, breathing baby. Eli staggered forward, the scene both impossible and magnetic. The closer he got, the more he could see a tiny face, red-cheeked, and sleeping peacefully despite the unnatural place it had been left. The child's hands were balled into fists, rising and falling with each tiny breath. Eli's shadow fell over the box, and the baby stirred but did not wake. And then he saw it. The carving, etched into the front of the pine box, rough and ragged, as if done with a hunting knife, were 2 words: Eli Cade. His own name. Eli stumbled back, nearly falling. He stared at the carving, then at the baby, and then again at the grave. Sweat broke out across his forehead, though the air was chill. He looked around the cemetery, half expecting someone to rise from the earth and explain the cruel scene. But there was nothing, just wind and silence. And that box. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers brushing the edge of the wood. The baby shifted slightly, letting out a small coo. Alive. Warm. Real. Eli dropped to his knees. The pain in his gut was unbearable now, but the confusion in his mind hurt more. Who would do this? Why here? Why now? And how the hell did they know his name? He'd faced down outlaws, bounty hunters, and lawmen with less fear than he felt now. Because this was unnatural. A baby in a coffin. A name meant for a dead man. A grave dug for someone who wasn't yet buried. The gunslinger who came to Bitter Wash to die now found himself staring into something he didn't understand. Not death, but something far stranger. Eli Cade knelt beside the coffin for what felt like a long, hollow stretch of time. His breathing grew shallow and uneven, the pain in his gut rising like a fire about to consume him whole. But he couldn't move away. Not yet. He stared at the child lying inside that pine box, the impossibility of the moment pressing on his mind heavier than any gunfight he'd ever walked into. He had no enemies cruel enough to play a joke like this. No friends clever enough to pull it off. It felt ancient and cursed, and yet, right there before him, it was all as real as the blood cresting on his shirt. The baby shifted again, just a small movement beneath the blanket, as if it felt the weight of his gaze. Eli leaned closer, squinting into the shade of the box. The infant was swaddled tightly, but its face was turned just enough that Eli could make out the shape of its nose, the fine dark lashes, the softness of the cheeks. A thin wisp of black hair crowned the baby's head. It didn't look sick, didn't look abandoned, even just asleep. As if someone had laid it here gently and walked away without saying a word. He rubbed his hand across his jaw. His fingers shook. There it was again, that crude carving on the coffin. Eli Cade, his name, etched in jagged strokes with no elegance, no artistry. Someone hadn't meant it to be pretty, just clear, just final. And it wasn't on a gravestone or marker, but on a box meant for the dead. And yet, the only thing in the coffin was a baby with no name. Or perhaps a baby with his name. He sat back, pressing a blood-streaked hand to his forehead. The heat of the sun clashed against the cold dread crawling up his spine. This wasn't some bandit's prank. This was personal. This was deliberate. And whoever had left this child here, they'd known Eli would come. They had counted on it. He stood slowly, muscles screaming, and looked around the graveyard again. The breeze stirred the long grass, but there was no one in sight, no footprints but his. No horses tied to posts. No campfire smoke in the distance. Just the forgotten graveyard of a dying town, and this impossible coffin left in its corner. The silence didn't comfort him. It sharpened everything. A sound broke the stillness, soft and hype-pitched. The baby had woken. Eli turned and saw its little face scrunch up, lips trembling. Then came the cry, sharp, raw, and desperate, echoing off the stones, the kind of sound that turned a man's blood cold and hot at the same time. He stepped forward on instinct, forgetting pain and confusion for one moment. With surprising care, he bent down, slid one arm beneath the child's body, and lifted it into his arms. The baby weighed almost nothing. It settled against him easily, though its cries didn't stop. Eli rocked back on his heels, holding the child close to his chest, unsure what to say or do. That's when he noticed the slip of paper. It had been tucked into the blanket near the child's heart, folded carefully, fragile with dust, as if it had been placed there with intention. He pulled it free with 2 fingers and unfolded it, heart pounding against his ribs like war drums. Only one sentence had been scrawled in a woman's hand, crooked and uneven, as if written in haste or pain. "He has your eyes. I had nowhere else." Eli stared at the words for a long time. The handwriting was familiar, though blurred by time. He could almost hear her voice, low, determined, tinged with sorrow. Maria, the woman he'd left behind in Juarez nearly a year ago. She'd loved him once, hated him later. He had thought it ended there, but maybe it hadn't. He looked down at the baby. The child's eyes, open now, were a gray-blue. His color, his shape, and suddenly the coffin didn't look like a trap. Anymore, it looked like a question, a crossroads. He'd come to Bitterwash to die, but maybe death had other plans. Maybe something else, something alive had been waiting for him instead. Eli stumbled out of the cemetery with the child in his arms, the note still clenched in his free hand. The sun was beginning to dip toward the west, painting the abandoned town in streaks of fire and shadow. Each step sent a bolt of pain through his gut, but his grip on the baby never loosened. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away from that graveyard, away from that box. The coffin had served its purpose. Whoever had left it there hadn't meant to bury a child, they'd meant to wake a dying man. He crossed the rickety footbridge behind the chapel, heading toward the collapsed schoolhouse. Once, long ago, it had been a place of noise and laughter. Now it was just another skeleton of Bitterwash, picked clean by wind and time. Still, the front of the structure offered a sliver of shade and shelter. Eli eased himself down against the wooden siding, cradling the baby in the crook of his arm. The crying had stopped. The child blinked up at him, now curious, those storm-gray eyes wide and searching. "You ain't supposed to exist," Eli muttered, voice thick with weariness. "Not out here. Not like this." But the baby only blinked and gave a soft sigh, as if that truth didn't matter anymore. Eli looked again at the note. "He has your eyes." I had nowhere else. He remembered Maria, her fierce spirit, her dark eyes, the way she stood in doorways with her arms crossed and a fire in her voice. She'd never begged, never asked for pity. She'd known who he was when she let him in. He'd told her he wasn't the kind of man to stay. And she'd told him one night, with tears she thought he didn't see, "Then don't come back, unless you're ready to stop dying." He hadn't come back. He'd left her, riding for a bounty up north, chasing the same ghosts he'd always chased. But somewhere in that time, Maria had been left with something more than memories. A child, his child. And now, Maria was gone. Of that he was certain. A woman like her wouldn't leave her baby in a coffin unless she had no other choice. She had written the words with heartbreak in her bones. Eli could feel it. She hadn't trusted him, but she had trusted the blood that ran through her son's veins. Trusted that even a dying outlaw might find something worth protecting. Eli leaned his head back, eyes fluttering closed. The pain in his gut had dulled to a deep throb, the kind that told him he didn't have long. He knew how this sort of wound ended. Men bled out slow. He'd seen it, felt it. But now he had a baby in his arms, a son, most likely, and that changed things. He couldn't die. Not yet. Not with the boy still breathing. The sound came before he saw them, hooves on the hard pan, faint but fast. Riders. His eyes snapped open. He struggled to his feet, using the schoolhouse wall for support, tucking the baby tight against his chest. Through the broken boards, he saw them. 2 riders approaching fast from the southern ridge, kicking up dust in twin trails. Eli's first instinct was to reach for the Colt at his side, but his fingers stopped. He had no bullets left, and even if he did, he wouldn't fire with a baby in his arms. They came closer, and he saw the glint of metal badges on their coats. Lawman. Eli cursed under his breath. He had no idea who they were, but if they knew his face, knew his past, they'd ride hard and shoot faster. And now he wasn't just a dying outlaw, he was a dying outlaw with a child. That changed everything. He backed into the shadow of the building, heartbeat hammering, lungs aching. He could still run, maybe get as far as the canyon trail, or maybe he could hide, bargain, plead, but deep down, he knew the truth. The man he'd been, the outlaw, might not make it out of Bitterwash alive, but maybe something else could. The riders came fast, and they came with purpose. Even from a distance, Eli Cade could tell they weren't the usual kind who wandered into ghost towns looking for shelter. Their backs were straight, hands rested firm on holstered guns, and they rode like men used to being obeyed. Lawmen, or worse, bounty hunters, the kind who didn't ask questions before pulling triggers. Eli watched from the shadows of the broken schoolhouse, his heart pounding against his ribs. His body was on the edge of collapse, but instinct, sharp as ever, kept him upright. The baby stirred in his arms, letting out a soft whimper that made Eli freeze. He rocked the child gently, whispering something low and meaningless, just sound to soothe the soul too young to understand fear. The riders were close now, maybe 100 yards out. Dust rose around them like a storm front. Eli pressed his back to the wall and glanced at his Colt. It still sat heavy on his hip. The grip dark with sweat, but what good was a gun with no bullets? His thoughts raced. If they were here for him, he was done. He could barely walk, much less fight. But if they were just passing through, or looking for someone else, maybe, just maybe, he could vanish before they saw him. There was a shed near the back of the chapel, half buried in collapsed timber. It wouldn't hide much, but it might. By him time, the horses reined in, just outside the chapel. Eli peeked through a crack in the boards. One of the men dismounted, tall, wiry, with a face like sun-baked stone and a long gray mustache. The second stayed in the saddle, scanning the town slowly. The man on foot strode directly to the cemetery. Eli tensed. The coffin, the moment the man knelt by it and saw it empty, Eli knew the clock had started ticking. Whoever they were, they knew something about the baby. Maybe they'd brought it, maybe they'd followed it. Either way, they'd come expecting a body, and instead, they'd find an empty box. The man straightened and said something to his partner. Eli couldn't hear it, but the rider nodded and dismounted. The second man, broader, younger, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, unslung a rifle from his saddle and began walking toward the street. They were searching now. The game had changed. Eli weighed his options. If they were bounty hunters, they'd know his face. He'd been on more posters than he cared to count, though most were old and faded now, like the wanted man himself. Still, some names stayed alive longer than the men who carried them. But something in his gut, aside from the bleeding, told him this wasn't just about him. This was about the boy. Maybe the mother had sent them. Maybe they were there to protect the child, or maybe they wanted him dead. The note hadn't said much, and Maria had always played her cards close. Eli scanned the ground, then tucked the baby into his coat, wrapping the blanket tightly. He took a few deep, shallow breaths, grit his teeth, and pushed himself into motion. He slipped out the back of the schoolhouse, moving low. Every step was fire through his legs, his side. The blood from his wound had dried in places, but still oozed at the edges. He could feel his strength fading fast. He reached the chapel and crept behind it, ducking beneath the shattered archway of the side window. From here, he could see the two men now standing where the coffin had been. One of them picked something up from the ground. The note, maybe. The other turned, eyes scanning the horizon. Eli ducked just in time. Then he heard it. A third rider. The sound of hoofbeats, slower, heavier. From the east this time, Eli turned and saw a lone figure approaching through the orange haze of dust and dying light. A woman. Even from a distance, he could see the long braid, the way she sat tall and sure in the saddle. She wore no hat, no gun belt, but there was something about her posture unafraid, commanding. The two men in the cemetery didn't move. When the rider reached them, she dismounted with a slow, practiced grace, her eyes never leaving the coffin. Then, almost in unison, all three turned and looked toward the chapel, toward Eli, toward the baby in his arms. He didn't know how they knew where he was. He only knew the silence that followed meant one thing. They hadn't come to bury a child, had come to claim him. Eli stood frozen, breath shallow, heart hammering like a war drum in his chest. The woman dismounted without haste, dust swirling around her boots like smoke off a dying fire. Her presence wasn't loud, it was deeper than that, quiet and grave, like the hush before a thunderclap. Her face was shadowed beneath the falling light, but her stance told Eli all he needed. She was no ordinary traveler, no wandering widow or grieving sister. This woman had ridden here with a purpose, and her eyes were fixed straight on him. The two men didn't say a word as she passed them. They parted like gates opening for something sacred. One of them handed her the folded note, Maria's note, and she glanced at it for only a moment before tucking it into the sleeve of her coat. Her gaze never wavered from the chapel's side window. From Eli, from the bundle in his arms, she walked with slow certainty toward him, not with menace, but with inevitability. Eli's instinct screamed at him to run, but his body, broken and bleeding, had already given what it could. He pressed his back against the wooden wall and looked down at the child cradled to his chest. The boy was awake again, eyes calm and wide. Unfazed by the storm building around him, a shadow crossed the doorway. The woman stood at the edge of the ruined threshold, her silhouette cut sharp against the dying sun. She took one step inside and finally spoke. "You are Eli Cade," she said, not as a question, but as truth spoken aloud. Eli's throat was dry. Lips cracked, but he managed a hoarse reply. She didn't smile, didn't frown. Her expression held something older than sympathy, something between sorrow and duty. She stepped closer. "That child was not meant for a coffin," she said. "I figured that much out." Eli rasped, "Now tell me why someone left him in one with my name carved into the wood." The woman lowered herself into a crouch. "Now I level with him." Her face, in the fading light, looked weathered but regal, high cheekbones, deep eyes the color of thunderclouds, streaks of silver running through her braid. She looked Lakota, but her clothes didn't follow any tribe Eli had seen. She wore a long coat, lined with fur on the collar, and a necklace of beads and feathers that shimmered with movement. She placed her hand gently on the blanket, just above the baby's heart. "This boy carries blood older than yours," she said softly. "But your name was written because fate is not bound by blood alone." Eli stared, too tired to puzzle through riddles. "That's not an answer. It's all the answer I'm allowed to give." He blinked at her. "Allowed by who?" She looked away for the first time, toward the graveyard. "By the ones who buried her." Eli felt like the breath had been punched out of him. "Maria," he said. The woman nodded. "She died in a fire 6 nights ago. She kept the child hidden in the root cellar. The coffin, her last act, she carved your name because she knew you'd feel the pull." "Pull," Eli spat. "You think this is some kind of destiny? I was ready to die out here." You still might, the woman said plainly, but not until you understand what you were spared for. Eli's body slumped. He couldn't argue anymore. The pain in his gut had grown sharper, colder. His limbs felt distant, but even now, as the edges of his vision darkened, he held on to the child with all the strength he had left. Is he mine? He asked, almost whispering that the woman didn't speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was quieter. He is everyone's and no one's. He is yours, if you choose to be more than what you've been. Eli stared at her. You're not a bounty hunter, he said. No. Then what are you? She looked him straight in the eye and said, I am the one who finds the last flame in a dying fire, and decides whether to let it burn. For the first time, Eli felt fear unlike any he had known. Not of death, not of judgment, but of purpose. She stood slowly, then extended a hand. Come, if you can walk. Eli looked down at the baby, then at the blood on his shirt, then at the hand reaching out to him. He didn't know what waited beyond that chapel doorway, but he knew he couldn't stay where he was. Eli took the woman's hand. It wasn't strength that lifted him to his feet, not fully. It was something else. Some ancient pull between the dying and the living. The woman helped him stand, careful not to jostle the child in his arms. World tilted, black spots dancing at the edge of Eli's vision, but he blinked them away and planted his boots firmly in the dust. The baby stirred but didn't cry, eyes wide and steady, as if he, too, understood that something had shifted. The two men who'd come with the woman stood silently as they approached. No questions, no suspicion. One of them handed Eli a canteen. He drank, the water metallic and cold, dribbling down his chin. The woman motioned toward the edge of town. We have a camp 4 miles east. The child will be safe there. You will rest? Eli coughed, a low ragged sound, then laughed without humor. I don't need rest, he muttered. I need a doctor. We have one, she said, of a kind. He didn't argue. He had no strength for it. The two riders brought up their horses, and the woman helped him onto one, steadying the child in his arms. She mounted behind him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her presence like a second heartbeat. The ride out of Bitter Wash was quiet. The landscape bled gold and rust under the setting sun, the rocks glowing like embers. Eli hadn't seen the land this way in years, not since he was a boy running cattle across state lines. It was beautiful, in that mournful way the desert always was, but tonight, it felt like a farewell. He didn't know if it was his own death he was leaving behind, or someone else's. As they rode, he turned his head slightly, toward the woman, behind him. You got a name? There was a pause before she answered. Not one you'd understand. That a riddle? It's a warning. Eli let that hang in the air. He looked down at the baby, who had fallen asleep against his chest. The same eyes, Maria's eyes, staring back at him from a face still soft with newness. Eli had once believed he couldn't leave anything good behind in this world, that he'd burned every bridge, buried every chance. But now here was a child, a coffin, a name carved in the wood, a woman who spoke in riddles and rode with silence. And something deep in Eli's gut told him that whatever road he was on now wasn't just about redemption, it was about survival. Maybe not his own. The trail turned east, snaking through a dry ravine. As they rounded a bend, Eli saw something. Up ahead, faint lights flickering beneath the cliffs. The camp. There were tents. Not many, just enough for a group that didn't want to be found. Smoke drifted from a fire pit in the center, and shadows moved around it. People tending flames, cooking, sharpening blades. A girl sang softly near the edge, her voice carrying across the rocks, like a lullaby meant for ghosts. The woman dismounted first and reached up for the child. Eli hesitated, clutching the bundle tighter. I'll carry him, he said. She nodded once and stepped back. A man came forward, an older figure wrapped in wool and leather. His beard braided, his hands calloused and steady. He took one look at Eli and motioned toward a tent set apart from the others. Lie down, he said simply. Let the bleeding stop. Eli staggered forward, ducked into the tent. Inside was warmth and smoke, and a cot laid out with animal pelts. He eased down, wincing, setting the baby beside him in a makeshift cradle of blankets. The woman entered, placing a bowl of herbs near his side. You're lucky, she said. I feel like death. You're not far off. But sometimes, death waits. When there's a child watching. Eli closed his eyes, the scent of sage thick. In the air, the fire outside crackled, voices murmured. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. He whispered to the child, voice rough and low. You got no name yet. But I reckon, if I live through this, I'll give you one. Night fell gently over the canyon, wrapping the hidden camp in a velvet hush. The stars emerged like ancient watchmen, scattered across the sky in patterns older than maps. Eli Cade lay still beneath the hides, the fever rising and falling in waves. He could hear voices outside the tent, low and careful, speaking in a tongue that carried wind and stone in its syllables. The baby slept beside him, cheeks flushed with warmth. Fingers curled tight around a strand of Eli's shirt. Pain throbbed through Eli's side. a dull, smoldering ache that never quite left, but it had changed somehow. It no longer felt like death crawling closer. It felt like a wound the earth itself was tending to. The herbs had numbed the worst of it, and now the heat from the nearby coals eased his limbs. He drifted in and out of sleep, dreaming of flame-carved wood, of Maria's face whispering from the grave, of 6 riders who never spoke but always watched. In one of those dreams, or maybe it was something else entirely, Eli heard his own name, spoken aloud. Not the kind of way bounty posters did it, bold and hard and hollow, but soft, like someone calling it home. He opened his eyes. The woman was seated by the tent's entrance, facing the fire. Her braid glinted with beads, feathers swaying gently with the wind. She was whispering a prayer, or a song, or both. At her feet, the flames danced in patterns Eli didn't understand, sharp and curling, like symbols being drawn in light. The baby stirred, then let out a soft cry. Eli reached for him instinctively, and the sound quieted. The woman turned, her face lit in orange and gold. "He feels you," she said. "That's why he sleeps." Eli looked down. "He don't even know me. He doesn't have to." Children remember things we forget. You bled for him. That's a kind of bond deeper than memory. Eli nodded faintly, throat dry. Is he really meant for something? She rose and walked to his side. Kneeling, she reached into the folds of her coat and pulled out a carved stone, smooth black and etched with ancient symbols. She placed it in Eli's hand, closing his fingers around it. "He carries the mark," she said, "born under fire. Delivered through loss. His fate is tied to yours and yours to his." That's what Maria understood. That's why she carved your name. Eli looked at the stone, then at the baby. "And what do I do with him?" he asked. She stood slowly, voice steady. "You give him what no one gave you, a chance to live free of ghosts. You teach him not how to draw a gun, but how to walk away from one." Eli was quiet for a long time. The child's tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, warm and trusting. For a man who had spent most of his life destroying, the thought of becoming a protector felt foreign, like holding a book he couldn't yet read. But the truth was already inside him. It had always been. Outside the tent, the fire crackled again. A voice called softly, and the woman stepped out, leaving Eli alone with the child. The night deepened. Coyotes sang in the distance. Somewhere, nearby, water ran over rocks, a stream that had always been there, but which Eli had never noticed until now. He turned his head toward the boy. "You're a strange one," he whispered. "I seen death in every form, and none of it ever scared me. But you scare the hell out of me." The baby blinked up at him. "I reckon that means you're mine." He leaned back against the firs, breathing in the smoke and sage. The fever still burned, but it was fading now, and in its place came something else, something cleaner, something sharp and new. Eli Cade had lived a life of shadows, of blood, of regret too heavy to carry. But here, in this tent far from the reach of law and memory, he found something he never expected to find, a reason to wake up tomorrow. As the fire outside crackled its slow song, Eli whispered again, not to the woman, not to the ghosts, not even to himself, but to the boy. "I think I'll call you River. You came out of death, carved in wood, drifted right into my arms. And now, I reckon I'll carry you as long as I can." Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere far away, the coffin that once held a name began to crumble into dust.